The Bible is not just a history book, although there's a lot of history in it. It's not just a philosophy book. It's not just a book of religion. It's a book that at its core tells about an unbelievable experience. It's totally beyond parallel in anything in human history. It happens to be the person of Jesus. Right there in the center of the core of everything, there is this issue of Jesus Christ, who was born in Bethlehem, lived in Nazareth, and taught all through Judea, Samaria, and Galilee. Very small area, really, but that was the extent of his travels. He wrote nothing down. He had no library of writings or anything that we can refer to. It was what his disciples, his followers, told us about all their experiences, except for one. He was, according to every historical reality, put to death, buried in a tomb, and on the third day, the very first moments of the third day, raised himself back up from the dead and came back to life. Now you can scratch your head about that a long time and say, well, that's just what an incredible story. I mean, who believes that kind of stuff? We see that on television with, pretend things, X-Files and Twilight Zone, if you're of that generation, and we see people coming back from the dead with all the zombie movies. And this one's unique because he came back as himself, in exactly the same person that he had been before he died. He didn't have skin peeling off of him and vacant-looking eyes. He was the same person. He ate, he drank, he talked with them. He shared in a lot of different people, in a lot of different situations, in the same way that he had before. Now, he was different. His body had been marked. I mean, he still had the marks where he had been crucified. He still had the hole in his side where he had been pierced through with the spear and had his heart and lung punctured. Well, you say, how can anybody be alive when they've had their lung and their heart punctured? You mean he can't live with that? No, that's part of the miracle. He still had all the open wounds, but he was alive. And he was the same person in exactly the same way. He had to kind of work through this whole process gradually. We're told very early in his 3-year ministry here that a man came named Jairus, whose daughter was deathly ill. And on the way to her house, the little girl had died. And Jesus walked into the room and asked everybody to leave and lifted the girl up, and she was alive again, and he returned her to her parents. Now you would say, thank you very much, that's a wonderful story. Why didn't she come back as a zombie? Well, she was the same girl. It was just moments after she had died, and it would have been shocking if she was anything but the same girl. Her life was returned, and she continued to live. And then a little later, Jesus walked by and saw a lady taking her son. It must have been very late in the day. The tradition was that you had to bury the person who had died in that culture before sunset on the day that they had died. So if he had died, let's say in the middle of the night or in the early morning, they would have postponed the funeral as late in the day for the grieving process as possible, and then late in the evening would have laid his body in a tomb of those days. In those days, you laid the body in a box, either a stone or in a tomb with a lid on it that could be removed, and you used the tomb over and over and over and over again for all of the family. So as the bodies would deteriorate and decay down to where there was just a scattering of bones and things left over from the previous one, you would very gently move them to the side, and you would lay the body of the most recent person from the family to have died in there. They called it being buried with their fathers. Well, it was because they were right in the same tomb, the same box, burial crypt, we would call it a mausoleum today, as the people who had died in his family previously, and it was the family tomb. Then we put the lid back on, and then the bodies would continue to deteriorate. Well, they were on their way to the cemetery to bury this young man who was the only child of a widowed mother. And Jesus, having sympathy for her, reached up on the platform where they were carrying the body, and he took the young man by the hand and raised him back to life and turned him back over to his mother. A zombie? No. A ghost? No. He'd been dead maybe as long as almost 20 hours. He was most certainly dead. They had been working with him, cleaning the body, preparing the body, anointing the body for burial, wrapping it in the grave clothes, getting it ready for... They had been working with him, and they knew his body had no life in it. Okay? Well, always through the years, through the generations, even up to this point today, death, in its final moments, becomes like an iron wall reinforced with titanium. You can't get beyond that. Once you go to the other side of that wall, there's no coming back. I mean, there are life-giving treatments and things that we've got right now where we can resuscitate people within minutes, even just a short time. But 20 hours? 16 hours? 12 hours? No. Once you've died, you're pretty well done. But Jesus raised him back to life and gave him back to his mother, as good as he had been before. He was the same boy she had before. He continued to live. They continued to be together. He was her son. And then finally, there was the story of Lazarus. And as Jesus is going to Jerusalem for his last week of his life, he gets word that his very, very good friend and godly man named Lazarus has gotten sick and eventually died. Jesus arrived 4 days later. 4 days later. You see how we're progressing. There's a handful of minutes, maybe even a half an hour, and then there's a whole group of hours, maybe up as many as 20 hours. And now we're in a spot where Lazarus has been in the tomb for 4 days. Jesus tells Mary and Martha, his sisters, I am the resurrection and the life. Anyone who dies is not dead as long as I'm around. Well, he certainly looked dead when they put him in the tomb. And they certainly thought it was going to be a very ugly smell when they were asked to take the stone away from the front of the tomb and open up that grave, because they knew what was happening to that body. Jesus prayed a small prayer. You have to get the picture in your mind of this. This is no farther away than what you might travel to go to Walmart from the temple in Jerusalem. I mean, these folks lived just next door to Jerusalem, and the temple was right there, and they loved Lazarus at Jerusalem, and all the people and all the leaders in the temple in Jerusalem loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus. They spent a lot of time over there at Bethany, and they were over back and forth all the time. And so when Lazarus died, it was a great mourning event for everybody in the whole area, all of Jerusalem. And so all the people had come out of Jerusalem who loved God, who loved Mary, Martha, Lazarus. They had come over and were hanging out for the, well, you call it a wait today, you call it a Shiva. It's the grieving process. And there they were, crying and weeping and grieving over the loss of their friend. Jesus asked to go to the cemetery. That's not unusual. All the people knew that Jesus was a powerful man and had done many miraculous things. And he's talking about being the resurrection and the life. Resurrection means after you've died. Life means life both in this life as well as in the next life. But there was this problem. There was this issue. He had died. Okay, so he stands in front of the tomb and he prays a very short prayer, and then he speaks. Simply the sound of his voice, just the power of his words. Lazarus, come out. And within a few moments, Lazarus comes walking out of the tomb, completely alive, completely well from his illness, wrapped still in the grave clothes in which he had been placed when they put him in the tomb. And Jesus says, take off the grave clothes and take him home. Well, you can imagine that caused quite a stir. There were as many as several thousand people watching this whole process, stacked up all around the area, wondering what in the world Jesus was going to do. And 4 days. So immediately, as soon as they get back home, they decide they're going to have a celebration party. That Lazarus has been brought back to them. So everybody from Jerusalem is there. They want to celebrate. They want to slap him on the back. They want to ask him a bunch of questions. I mean, if this guy was down for 4 days, maybe he was brain dead. Maybe his blood just congealed and his brain is fried. And they had a lot of questions about whether or not this was real or not. They'd never seen anybody come back from the dead. Sure enough, it was real. There he was. He was the same guy. Now, I say that because when Jesus comes out of the tomb, this is the first time that anybody has allowed people to beat them to death, crucify them to death, allow them to humiliate him to death, allow his body to be put in a brand new tomb. I mean, this one didn't have a lot of bones, teeth, and stuff left behind. This was a tomb that was still new and it was still unused. So they put his body into a tomb and they closed it over with a big, huge stone, and they left him there under a military guard. A military guard was placed in front of the tomb, fully armed, and given the command, don't let anybody touch the body of Jesus. They were under that command. They would have been punished if they'd have failed or disobeyed. And the tomb was sealed. You would know if anybody tampered with it. And then, on what was a Sunday morning, just moments after dawn, Jesus comes out of the tomb alive. Now, someone would say, that's impossible. That's completely impossible. You see why this is such an important idea? Because if you believe that this is impossible, then you have to believe that it didn't happen. That it was made up. It was just a story written in an old dusty book someplace. The problem is, his coming back to life and appearing over and over again all over the community, and groups of people, as many as 500 at a time, and in different parts of the territory, and once up in Galilee, and he walks for hours and hours, walking with two disciples back to Emmaus, and he explains why it all had to be that way, and how he had predicted this was going to happen, and now it was completely fulfilled, and how it fulfilled all the scriptures and everything. I mean, he was not just a zombie. This was a thoughtful, caring, knowledgeable, loving individual. He didn't take out revenge on anybody that had killed him. It wasn't like he was trying to even up a score somewhere. He just said this was a part of the big plan, the whole reason I came to earth. And it was so transformational, and it was so hard to believe, that it changed the entire world history from that point forward. It changes the way we think about life here and the life beyond. You see, if he went into the place we call heaven, or the spirit realm, the world in the beyond death, and he came back 3 days later, he pretty well sets himself up as the expert on that subject. He pretty well captures the entire monopoly on explaining what it's like, because he had control both on this side and on that side, and the ability to come back to this side at will. So when he tells us something about what it's like, we probably ought to listen. He's got all the cards. And he said, it's just one person. It's the same person after death as it was before. It's just the same person after they've been dead and they come back. It's just one. It's not a repetition. It's not somehow going back and doing it again and again and again. It's not being reincarnated. It's not being born. I mean, I love Robin Williams, and I love What Dreams May Come and some of those things, but that isn't what Jesus said. And he was the expert. And if you don't believe that, and if you decide you're not going to accept that, simple fact, the resurrection, there isn't anything else about the story worth listening to. You can go ahead and do something else. You can go back and watching cat videos if you want to. Because this is the starting point where everything begins. And without this, none of the rest of it makes any sense. If you want to know how God put the world together, you start here. And I'd like to start there. I'd like this to be the beginning of a conversation. Now, in Facebook, you can respond to this. You can call me all kinds of silly names. And of course, in Facebook, we expect that we get hit with people who do not have the same opinion. And that's fine. There are people who do not want to accept the facts. I mean, there are people who think we still didn't go to the moon and walk around on the surface of the moon. They just deny that it ever happened. It makes it a little hard when they're sending spaceships up on a routine basis to resupply the International Space Station. So maybe there are rockets, and maybe there are people who go on long journeys and who stay up in space a long time. But you know, back in my youth, there were a lot of people who said that was just phonied up on a TV stage. Now, we call that ignorance. Not because they were dumb or because they were stupid. But they ignored the reality. Ignore means ignorant of the reality. That's what the definition in the dictionary is. They were unaware or blinded to or did not take into account the facts. Now, if you want to say that there was no World War II, and therefore no millions of people executed in the death camps of all kinds of different ethnic realities, but certainly the Jewish people were the main target. If you want to say there was no 9/11, that was all just a pretend. A real estate developer decided he needed to clear off some space in the middle of downtown New York so that he could build his own tower. And there weren't militants on those airplanes taking over and hijacking airplanes and driving them into buildings. You can be ignorant of the facts. But I lived there. I lived through that. My parents lived through World War II. My family lived through something called the Reformation, where Martin Luther nailed his challenge to the Catholic Church on the Wittenberg church door, back in the 1500s, and it changed everything. Now you can say, okay, we ought to all be Catholic, we ought to all have the same. No, back in the 1500s, everything changed. One man put his challenge to the Catholic Church on the door, and it began a discussion that changed everything. Okay, let's pretend that didn't happen. We're going to we're going to become ignorant of that reality. You can live your whole life and it doesn't make any difference what Martin Luther did or what happened on 9/11 or Pearl Harbor. You don't have to know about it. You can live in ignorance of it. But it didn't mean it didn't happen. Jesus came back from the dead, and it happened. And there was a reason it happened. I'll explain more about that in the next one.